Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. Tonight, we have almost reached our 120th show. That's right, 120 shows, almost. Now, some prime ministers don't last that long. In fact, they scarcely managed a couple of 3 shows of our lifetime. Hi, I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. Thanks to you, the TNT Show and Indie Live are growing and delivering more exciting shows than ever before. You can watch this show on indielive.net, which is streamed out onto YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, if you go to YouTube, you can see all the previous shows. That's 119 odds. And now, I always make this plea, but I feel it's worth repeating it. You have a chance to support Indie Live. And when you see the crowdfunder come up or the details on screen, please do what you can to support this vital channel. If you're upset by the media coverage of political events, where you might find that you feel that journalism is junked in favor of stenography or rehashed press releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. And the question, as always, is, will you be here for us? Please donate whatever you can. Now, it's been another great day for British democracy. Record-breaking Minister Gavin Williamson, he of the abusive tongue, has now achieved the distinction, if that's the correct terminology, of being fired by 3 different prime ministers. Incredibly, this means that a total of 18 ministers or whips have resigned or been sacked from this government since the start of 2022. So much for strong and stable government. Huh? Tonight, we are talking to a special guest. We'll be discussing Europe. We'll be discussing Scotland, independence and federalism, and so much more besides, with foreign affairs expert David Clark, who's a former advisor to Robin Cook. He's here for a full hour, and he'll be taking your questions live. There's still time to get your questions considered. Go to the details on screen and you can do all of that. We've had 1 or 2 points that have been put to us in advance. We'll see if we've got time to cover those as well. And thank you for sending the advanced questions, everyone. TNT, as you know, stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now, to our guest. Tonight, The Nation talks to David Clark. Thanks for joining us, David. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. What's been happening in your life recently?
Well, I'm busy analysing the situation in Ukraine and the war with Russia and the implications of that more generally. So that's consumed a lot of my time in the last few months. 9 months now, almost since the start of the war. I've got a long engagement with Ukraine as a country. Actually, after I left the Foreign Office in 2001, I became involved in the events following the Orange Revolution, in helping the government of Ukraine to communicate its messages internationally. So it's a country I've known well over a long period of time. I've also been very engaged in Russian affairs for a long time as well. I used to run a small discussion group called the Russia Foundation here, well, not here anymore for me, but when I lived in London. So I've had a long connection with both countries and take a close interest in their internal affairs and their relations with each other. And that's a big part of what I've been doing recently.
And what do you make of tonight's news when reportedly 40,000 Russian troops are in full retreat towards the Dnipro?
I think it became pretty clear within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks of the start of the invasion that Putin was going to fail in his objectives. The resistance has been huge from Ukrainians. I think the support that we've given them militarily has allowed them to regroup and fight back more effectively over time. And I think the balance of power is only going to shift more in Ukraine's favor as we go further on. Russia's ability to regenerate its forces is quite limited. They can mobilize troops with brute aggression, although it leads to large outflows of young men in particular from Russia resisting the mobilization. But what they can't do is equip them with modern weaponry. They have no ability to remanufacture and re-equip their forces with modern weaponry, whereas the West has the ability over time to continue supplying Ukraine with more and better weapons. So I think Putin is in a losing position. The only question is whether or not he decides to find some kind of way out for him, however difficult he may find that, or whether he presses ahead to what I expect next year, at some point next year, in the early months following the thaw in February, March, will be a cataclysmic defeat from which his regime will not recover.
Oh, really? Do you think he might have to step down?
I think it's impossible to imagine a situation in which he loses this war and his regime has any longevity. How quickly the end point comes for him is a matter of conjecture. It could last a period of 2 or 3 years. It could happen very suddenly. But the people who know the country best will be as taken by surprise at the pace of events when they unfold as the rest of us. It's not something you can really put a timetable on. But the fundamentals point to one conclusion, which is that the regime Putin has built is unsustainable and cannot withstand the kind of defeat which I think in one form or another is now inevitable.
Now, I mentioned moving on, slightly different, moving from the sublime to the somewhat ridiculous, in fact. I mentioned Gavin Williamson, but he's not alone in the what appears to some people in this country to be a bit of a shambolic government and quite far from being strong and stable. How would you say the UK is viewed internationally?
Well, I think with incredulity and pity. To a large extent, whenever I interact with people from abroad, there is still a lot of goodwill towards the UK in a lot of places. And the conversations I've had with people since 2016, really, when I think I first started to get, the kind of questions from people that I spoke to on my travels, what's gone wrong with the UK? Why are you doing this? In response to the Brexit vote, it's always been more in sort of sadness than mockery. There are people obviously who don't like the UK and who enjoy our discomfort, Vladimir Putin being among them, no doubt. But mostly it's one of surprise, concern, and pity, because until 2016 we were considered to be quite a pragmatic country, level-headed. Empirical in our approach to looking at issues, evidence-based. And all of those assumptions now, when people look at the UK, are being reconsidered. They're seeing us in a new light and not a more favourable light, I'm afraid.
When you look at people like the Prime Minister, he has never faced the public, as it were. He hasn't ever stood for election in a general election. Do you think people overseas perhaps view that his legitimacy and see that in some question?
No, I'm not sure about that. I think they understand our system. They understand that it's a parliamentary system, and they understand also that prime ministers can change between elections without having to trigger a new election. That much about our political system is familiar to most informed people, certainly when they look at the UK from outside. And I think actually, if you look at the reaction of the markets, compared to the Liz Truss episode, Sunak looks like a sort of return to some kind of competence at a minimal level. So in that sense, he appears as a reassuring figure, but only because of the depths to which we had sunk under Liz Truss. But also, I would argue that the decline of standards in public office had started much earlier than that, obviously with Boris Johnson. And neither of these figures, or even Rishi Sunak, frankly, would have stood a chance of getting the top job if it weren't for the effect of Brexit, which has led to a collapse in standards in politics, which may have been observed over a longer period at a lesser level, but it's gone into freefall really since 2016. People are doing things and acting in ways that they would never have conceived of doing before because of the dynamic of the unhinging dynamic of Brexit. It's been such a corrosive thing, and not just in the very narrow sense of the extent to which it's damaged this country economically. It's damaged this country culturally. It's damaged this country politically. It can't function in any normal way, and I just wonder whether there's ever a point at which the UK could recover from the blow that it's inflicted on itself. We did this to us. We did this to ourselves, and I have to say that I'm very sceptical that it ever can.
It is interesting though, because I mean, if Rishi Sunak, for any reason, had to step down as his predecessor did, do you think the country would accept a third leader of the Conservative Party as Prime Minister? Don't you think that would be some sort of breaking point, and people would say, no, one is unfortunate, two is dreadfully unfortunate, but three, we just can't handle that. You need to go to the country and seek their approval.
I think the breaking point's already been passed. Actually, it's in terms of people's perceptions of the Conservative Party's ability to handle the responsibilities of government. I don't think they will recover their position in time to put in a competitive challenge at the next election. I think Sunak will obviously deliver a less bad result for the Tories than a Liz Truss government would have done. But even if Sunak is replaced, people will just take it as confirmation of what they already have concluded about the Conservatives. I think there wouldn't be any mechanism for them really to do anything about it. The decision on the timing of another election would still be in the hands of a Conservative leader, provided they manage to retain the confidence of their colleagues. And no party has ever voted itself into an early election that it knows it will get badly beaten in. So I think we have to expect that whatever happens, this Parliament will run more or less its full course into the second half of, well, it would be 2024.
But you can see the troubles piling up. The nurses have announced that they definitely will strike across the country. I don't think that's ever happened before.
No.
And I wonder how a government can continue to function when people are being denied health care. I expect that people are asked, I haven't seen the polls most recently, but I suspect that people are asked, whom do you have more confidence in, the government or the nurses? I suspect they would come down on the side of the latter.
They would, and there's an argument for saying that the conditions are better for the Conservatives to fight an election now, as bad as they seem, than they will be at any point within the next 2 years. So they might as well go now. And I understand the logic of that, but the reality remains that if there was an election now, the Conservative Party would certainly lose, and they would lose badly. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, political parties just don't go to the polls in those circumstances. What they do to rationalize the act of clinging on is this hope that something will turn up, that there will be some miracle that will intervene in the next 2 years to turn the electoral tide and mean that they can perform better than they would do if there was an election now. So as much as I would like an early election, as much as I believe that it would be strongly in the interests of the country as a whole to have an early election now, I still don't see the circumstances in which that happens, unless there's a very deep split within the Conservative Party, which of course you can't rule out, but I can't, on the immediate horizon, see what the breaking issue would be that would allow that to happen.
Well, I suppose people who are concerned about keeping their seats when they're confronted with thousands of nurses outside their constituency office might feel differently after a while, but who knows?
Yes, but if you're a Conservative MP worried about your seat, that points to as much delay as you can, as you're able to find in going to the ballot box.
I suppose the other argument is a cynic would say this is a good time to lose an election. If you think you're going to lose it anyway, lose it and let the other lot carry the can.
There's an argument for that, but of course it won't apply to Rishi Sunak because he's only just got the job, and he knows that if he loses an election, his time as Prime Minister will come to an end. So he will certainly want to delay as long as possible. Whether there would be at some point enough of a faction within the Conservative Party to effectively take that matter out of his hands is the only thing that I could imagine triggering an early election.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I don't see what the issue on which they would do that might be. But of course, I continue to be surprised by the turn of events in British politics. So that's how I see things now, but that's not to say that it's going to be the case.
Yeah, I think, what is it? Someone once said, "Events, dear boy, events," and I think that coupled with the old cliche about a week is a long time in politics. Who knows? But
Yes.
we've had the arrest of a journalist who was filming protesters yesterday. What do you make of that? What does that tell you about the country generally when journalists are arrested?
I find it very troubling, and it's only one straw in the wind, really, of a wider trend of the UK doing things which I've seen already happen in other places in a more extreme form. And I'm talking particularly about not just Russia, but also Hungary under Viktor Orban, of a certain political ideology, authoritarian populist ideology of the right, which no longer accepts the principles of democratic pluralism, regards the rules of politics themselves as being weapons, not as neutral instruments arbitrating between different political forces, but as a weapon that they can use to try and entrench their power. Because they see themselves as being, this is the key thing about populism, is because they see themselves as the representative of the people as a whole, they see themselves as being the only legitimate political force compared to others. So they're not willing to lose power, they're not willing to share power, and they use a variety of techniques in order to make sure that they can do that, restricting the franchise, restricting voter rights, manipulating the media, getting rid of bits of the media that are hostile or take a too much of an independent line. The right to protest is another one. The weaponization of history and attacks on academia, culture wars, the attempt to polarize society around culture war issues. These are all familiar patterns of behavior. The demonization of immigrants and people from abroad and international institutions. And the UK hasn't gone anywhere near as far as Putin's Russia, obviously, or even Viktor Orban's Hungary. But of course, there was a time when they were just embarking on some of these processes and using some of these techniques. And I think there's a lot of complacency in the UK amongst people who ought to know better about what all this means. People say, no, it's just you're overreacting. This is just these are just minor adjustments in the way things have been done. There's nothing really to be worried about. I disagree fundamentally. I think when I look back at the last 20 years and I look at my engagement with Russia from around 2003, 2004, when I was involved in efforts to try and alert people to the very earliest stages of Putin's march towards authoritarianism, people were saying exactly the same things about Putin then. And looking back on it, it's quite clear the time to stop it is at the beginning. Because once the process has been allowed to unfold to a certain point, it becomes harder and harder to stop it. So, the alarm bell needs to be rung. There are too many independent and separate signs of things moving in the same direction simultaneously. So I'm alarmed about where things are going, and I would be alarmed at the thought of what the Conservatives might do if they somehow manage to secure another term in office. Thankfully, it looks very unlikely, because, as I say, I think we've something has snapped with the British public. But again, it's the backdrop of Brexit that has allowed all of these things to happen. The prorogation of Parliament, the illegal prorogation of Parliament, disregard for the rule of law, and the norms of politics. All of these things, these collapsing standards, have been justified and have happened against the backdrop of Brexit.
Yeah, and also the institutions seem to have become enfeebled. There's an argument that says the police were simply reflecting the views of the Home Secretary as they understood them.
Yes, but
And
of
she
course,
has said tonight that she feels that they were quite right to be firm.
well, it's not the job of the police to serve the government like that. They are public servants, and they are supposed to police by consent. And while I understand that obviously, that the police have to intervene to stop protesters when they are causing significant public disruption, that's absolutely right. It's the targeting of media, associated media, and apparently the demands of the police when these journalists who'd identify themselves as journalists, after being detained for several hours, there's a repeated demand from the police that they should identify their sources for so that they can identify protest organizers. When the police start using heavy-handed tactics to force journalists to disclose their sources, this country's in a very, very perilous position, and there needs to be a very, very firm pushback against that as a practice. And there are other things too. I haven't even mentioned the attempts to sort of limit the court and to protect government from the mechanism of judicial review. This is again, I saw this in Russia unfold. We've seen it in Hungary and in Poland, where the similar ideologies of authoritarian right-wing populism are governing. These forces, they cannot stand any idea that there is a check or a balance on their power, and they systematically try to strip those away, remove them, dismantle them, or intimidate them. And the media, the courts, academia, civil society, these are all important checks and balances of a properly functioning liberal democracy, and they have to be protected.
Yeah, it's a great pity we don't have a written constitution that would have provided that protection, but there you go.
Well, that's another weakness, yes, for sure.
Talking about authoritarian figures, we could perhaps take some questions now. I was thinking about Trump in the US and some of his approach to democracy, if that's not a contradiction in terms. The question here is, with the likely change in the US Senate / Congress, does David suspect there will be pressure to lower support for the Ukraine?
I'm feeling a lot more reassured today than I was yesterday about what might unfold. I think there is certainly a faction, I would say the dominant faction within the Republican Party, that would like to do that and have explicitly threatened that they would. Kevin McCarthy, who's the minority leader for the Republicans in the House of Representatives and will become the majority leader if they get a majority, has explicitly said that that's something that they're going to look at doing, and we all know why. We all know why that's the case. The heart has never really been behind American support for Ukraine. Some of them identify quite openly with Vladimir Putin and his style of politics. And they blame Ukraine to some extent for Trump's defeat because of that impeachment. And they some of them would welcome the opportunity to take revenge. There's absolutely no question about that. But the scale of Republican advances have been minimal, really. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to take the Senate. They look like they probably will get a majority in the House of Representatives, but it will be a very small one. So the threats that they've been making to cut off military aid, I think now looks like something that they will not be able to deliver on, because there will be enough Republicans, even in the House of Representatives, I expect, who will take a different line, a more independent line, and will continue to support American military aid to Ukraine. So I think one of the big losers overnight, apart from Donald Trump himself, as a result of the outcome of the US midterm elections, is Vladimir Putin, because he's been banking on this. There's no question about it. He's been hoping that this is one of the things that might save him from the quagmire that he's walked into. I think that hope is now vanishing in front of him.
Do you think if Putin were to go, and based on what you've just said, it sounds likely, who would be likely to replace him?
That's a very good question. I mean, he has made extensive efforts to prevent any possibility of somebody positioning themselves as an heir apparent. I mean, there are lots of people around him. It could be any one of them. So I wouldn't want to speculate on that. Speculating on that would be, I think, even more futile than speculating on the timing of Putin's departure, circumstances of his departure. But it could be somebody quite hard line. I mean, we shouldn't expect that when Putin goes that somehow Navalny is going to become president of Russia. I mean, in the very long term, it's not inconceivable. But in the first instance, it's more likely to be somebody like Nikolai Patrushev, who's the secretary of the National Security Council, a former intelligence chief, a hawk, foreign policy hawk. So someone like that could easily be the person who takes over, who becomes the president in the sort of short to medium term is another question altogether. But Russia itself is going to remain a problem country for a long time to come, I'm afraid. There isn't going to be a sort of 1991 moment where the old order collapses and a large number of Democrats suddenly take over with a commitment to try and move the country in a liberal democratic direction. It's going to be a country that reacts to its defeat initially with resentment and a retreat into conspiracy theories about why this has happened to them. It will be a long process of adjustment for them to accept responsibility for what's happened and to realize that it's a result of decisions that they made, not intrigued by foreign powers or internal opponents against them. So, the question of how to handle Russia is going to remain, I think.
Oops, we seem to have lost David. Oh, you're back.
Yes, I don't think my internet connection dropped. Yours? I apologize for that. What was I saying when I cut out?
Oh, you were saying that it's unlikely that there will be a short road back from for Russia towards liberal democracy. It sounds like it's going to be a long, long trail. I expect, and you mentioned the fact that they will probably retreat into a period of conspiracy theories and finding someone to blame for somebody's scapegoat for their the mishaps of.
I think that's highly likely, and of course, there may be significant internal disruption within Russia itself. I mean, people make the mistake of thinking that when the Soviet Union ended, that was the end of empire in Eurasia. It wasn't. The Russian Federation itself is a kind of empire composed of a large number of different ethnic and religious groups. So it's not a culturally homogenous, ethnically homogenous country. There are a lot of pressures that could easily lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation itself, not least in the Northern Caucasus. So it's going to be a difficult time for Russia, and how they react is going to be one of the things to watch.
Interesting. Well, we should all do that, I think. Moving closer to home, as they say in the old cliche, you have travelled, as it were, in UK terms, from a position of being a unionist quite some way now in the constitutional framework. Describe for us your journey and what motivated you to change your mind.
Well, obviously, I took a very close interest in the referendum in 2014. I don't live in Scotland. I haven't lived in Scotland since 1988, but I retained strong connections there and a strong interest in its politics. And I was against independence at the time. But my two brothers, who both still live in Scotland, took a very different view from me. They voted yes. Like I think a lot of families, we were divided in that sense. But I listened to what they were saying at the time, and they're not nationalists in any sense. I don't think either of them had voted SNP prior to the referendum. For them, it wasn't really about creating a new country or creating a border or about flags or any of those things. For them, it was quite simply the most effective way that they could envisage significant political change for them and the people around them. It was about creating a new politics. And in order to do that, to create a new nation state that would allow that new politics to flourish. So I even at that time was reassessing my own understanding of the forces that were driving support for independence. And obviously I looked at a lot of the coverage at the time, and I couldn't help but be impressed about the quality of the debate and the level of engagement and the way in which people responded to the vote. It was unlike any other political event I think I'd seen, possibly other than the 97 general election, in terms of its optimism and outlook. But at that time, I still believed that there was legs in the idea of a reformed UK that could become a progressive multinational democracy that would have something of value to contribute to its citizens and more generally to the world. And I wasn't ready to give up on that vision. But, you know, the point about the Brexit referendum for me in 2016, which changed everything, isn't just that the UK was dragged out of the UK left the European Union and Scotland was dragged out reluctantly as a result of that. That was bad enough. For me, it was really what it said about the state and psychology of the UK. And it seemed to me that, you know, the UK was stuck. It was trapped, really, psychologically, trapped by its own mythology and unable to escape that. And it was thinking in backward-looking terms, and it was thinking in terms of explaining its own problems with reference to external factors rather than addressing their internal problems honestly. And it occurred to me really as a result of that the UK constitutional framework is just suboptimal for the achievement of significant political progress. Certainly suboptimal for the kind of politics that I believe in as a social democrat. It just doesn't work. It's constitutionally decrepit. The different parts of it, don't work institutionally anymore in the way that they used to. There's no sense of collective belonging or loyalty. Certainly no common political culture. I mean, I certainly used to subscribe to this view that the division within the UK didn't run along the Scotland-England border. It ran between the north and south of the UK, and that Scotland saw the world in very similar terms to the north of England, had very similar experiences to the north of England, post-industrial and neglected from the centre, much more egalitarian in its outlook and its political instincts and aspirations. Brexit broke that. It showed to me that there isn't really a common political culture in the sense that I used to believe there was. Working class voters in the north of England reacted very, very differently to the choice that was put in front of them in 2016 to voters in Scotland. So that was a process of reassessment, and I concluded from that it would be better not just for Scotland but for all parts of the UK if the UK came to an end, and that it would allow the constituent parts of the UK to pursue their aspirations, their diverging and separate aspirations, much more effectively than if we pretended that we could still be governed as a single constitutional unit. And that really was the beginning of me for my reassessment. I will say that philosophically, in the very broad philosophical sense, I still consider myself a unionist. I believe in uniting people. I believe that unions in different forms and different ways are desirable, bringing people together, whether it's in the workplace or between countries. I desire cooperation between different peoples, different cultures, different nations. But for me, that impulse, that aspiration, that set of values that I would describe as small U unionism is now invested much more in the belief that Scotland can rejoin the European Union than it is in the an attempt which I think would ultimately fail to try and patch up the increasingly broken British political system. There are better ways, I think, for everyone.
A number of people would say, well, we agree with much of what you just said, David, but we think there must be somewhere a federal solution to all of this. That's the best way to go, they would say.
I used to hope so. I consider myself a federalist, and I hoped that the Blair government's changes in bringing devolution to Scotland, Wales, and in different forms Northern Ireland would be the beginning point of a process that would lead us towards something approximating federalism. But of course, that immediately ran into the problem of how you make something as lopsided as the UK work in a federal sense. You would have the three constituent parts of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales governing alongside this huge, by comparison, entity, which would be England. So how do you create structures that would work alongside each other easily in that very lopsided context? And the answer that's often been given is that, well, you have English regional government. And of course, they began to go down that route with the idea of an assembly for the northeast of England. And that was because that was considered to be the place where the idea would be embraced most enthusiastically. Yeah. And voters there rejected it. They weren't interested in creating another tier of government. They didn't see the need. And I think, as I've become increasingly aware in the years that I've lived in England, there is, outside some fairly narrow political circles who are often dismissed as Guardian readers, intellectuals, Remainers, whatever now, there is no interest in federalism as a political idea at all, none. And if there was an attempt to try and create some federal structure in England as a way of solving Labour's problem in Scotland, the result you would get, it would be a huge backlash amongst English voters. They would reject it. And if they were given an opportunity at a referendum, they would vote it down. I'm absolutely certain of that. The view in England, whether it's correct or not, and I imagine a lot of viewers will, like me, take issue with the idea. But the view in England is that they've already made enough compromises and concessions to satisfy Scotland's aspirations. They agreed to the creation of a parliament. They accept a different funding formula for Scotland. If we go to them and say, well, we need something else to keep the UK together, I think their reaction will be, well, that's your problem, not ours. So I'm aware of the work that Labour is now doing to try and come together and bring together some new constitutional settlement. And I'm sure that Gordon Brown, when he reports, will produce something which is typically thoughtful and elegant and well thought through. I've no doubt about that. And I will look at that blueprint and I will see huge merit in it, and it will be something that I will wish could have been possible 15, 20 years ago. But I also know that it just won't work. It will just never be accepted as a political idea. So I think they're on a hiding to nothing there. I think the moment for the UK to change in the way that UK federalists want it to change has already passed, unfortunately. So I don't see that as a solution to the problems that we're facing.
Some people have argued that Scottish independence, were it to happen, would be beneficial to the rest of the UK and England in particular. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's true. It would be probably wrong to say that I support Scotland's independence, only because that's quite a narrow way of thinking about it. I support the UK's dissolution, not only because I think it would be good for Scotland, but because I think everyone else would benefit from it. I think England would be transformed by becoming an independent country. And I think that's where we're going to end up. I think Scotland will almost certainly leave at some point when it's given the opportunity to vote for it. I anticipate. I mean, it's not certain, nothing's certain in politics, but I would expect that to happen. I think Northern Ireland's been an anachronism since it was created, and it only looks like more of an anachronism with the passage of time. It's just an entity that has no future. And I think there's increasing realization of that. And I think that's why you're seeing amongst the hardline unionists in Northern Ireland a process of radicalization that's taking place in response to that realization. I'm fascinated by the extent and speed with which opinion in Wales appears to be shifting as well. Yeah. That's something that doesn't get enough attention. I think it's a significant development. But for England, I think the benefits would be huge. It would allow them to see themselves and the world around them in new ways. I think stripped of the mythology of Britain and Britishness. I think they would at last be able to face the world on their own terms as a nation, and they would begin to address things that they haven't really addressed in the past about their own internal imbalances. Yeah. You know, the existence of the UK really, I think, papers over this as a problem, but there are huge internal balances within England, geographically and socially. I think as an independent country, England would have to address that. The constitutional problems that you described, this kind of antiquated constitutional mindset of proceeding on the basis of custom and precedent, unwritten codes and rules and so on, which are increasingly inadequate as a means of governing a complex modern society. They would have to readdress that as well, because they would have to think about what kind of rules they wanted for their own governance in a way that they haven't done before and have been reluctant to do before. And I think, you know, things are often cited as being negatives of independence are not. You know, like having a land frontier on the English landmass, an international land frontier, or possibly two, if Wales becomes independent eventually. I think that would be a very healthy development for England, because instead of indulging in this mythology of themselves as an island race, they would, in that sense, become a normal country with normal issues to deal with. So I think, you know, I'm as much attracted to the idea of the UK's dissolution for what it means for England as I am for what it means for Scotland, not least because I live in England. Yeah.
So there's a phrase going around that which was coined by somebody quite close to me, who said independence for Scotland could be mega for England, i.e. mega standing for make England great again.
Yeah.
But I mean, if Trump can use it, I mean, who knows? But it's interesting. I think that was very interesting, David. I think what might give people pause is when they look at the present arrangements. I mean, accepting your point about the future, that there would have to be a different constitutional setup with perhaps 3 states, as it were. One looks at the present situation and one looks at the Labour leader, and when he's asked questions about the Constitution, it seems to many people in Scotland he retreats into a sort of pre-2014 position, which is, this is just frankly unacceptable, and I will have no dealings with anybody who proposes such a change. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he's in a very difficult position. You know, I saw him on Sunday really struggling with the questions that were put to him on this, and, you know, visibly struggling with the questions that were put to him. He said at one point that Scotland's in a voluntary union with the rest of the UK, but then, you know, said that there wouldn't be a referendum because it wasn't what he considered to be the priority issue, and that therefore it you know, it wasn't going to happen. But if Scotland's in a voluntary union, with all due respect to Keir Starmer, what a member of Parliament representing a constituency in North London thinks is neither here nor there. It's what Scotland thinks that counts. I mean, the brute reality of this is that unionism's only strategy at the moment is to avoid a referendum. They don't really have any other strategy for coping with what they understand to be a situation that's gradually slipping away from them. They can't find a way of making a positive case for the UK to stay together. They resort to alarmist statements about what independence would mean for Scotland, which, against the backdrop of the UK's very visible decline, look increasingly worn and implausible. And the hope that there would be a majority Labour government which would make some kind of constitutional changes that would solve the problem as they see it. I don't think any of that will come to pass. I think they're rhetorically playing for time in the hope that events take a turn in their favour. But I just don't think they will.
I mean, I'm also confused though when Keir Starmer. I mean, if you were advising Keir Starmer right now, what would you say to him?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Labour is a unionist party. There's no question. Probably the most unionist party, actually, because its existence began after the point of union. It's the only one of the parties that's actually true of, and its foundational experiences are uniquely British experiences. I'm talking particularly about the Industrial Revolution, which gave rise to the labour movement in the first place. So that was a British experience, and it's deeply encoded in the Labour Party way of thinking. So I don't expect them to, suddenly accept the breakup of the UK, although significant parts of the party probably would. But the mainstream Labour opinion is not going to be one supportive of Scottish independence, and it doesn't need to be really, but they do need to follow through on this idea. I think that Scotland is in a voluntary union, and in a consistent way. What they need to say is, look, we don't want the UK to break up. We think it would be a shame. We think it would be bad for Scotland and for everyone else. But there's no point in keeping the UK together if it doesn't wish to be together. In all honesty, and that at some point that consent on which the union is based will need to be tested again, and they just need to accept that and move on, and prepare for the day in which they will have to make their case for keeping the UK together politically at the ballot box.
I mean, it does sound. To Scottish ears, some of the things that Keir Starmer said sounded alien. You saw the programme. He talked about we don't want too many immigrants for the health service. I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing his remarks.
He did say that. He did say that. Yes, I found that hard to understand. It didn't sound statesmanlike to me. It sounded like dog whistle stuff aimed at an audience that's deeply unsympathetic to that sort of material. Well, yeah, I think possibly a little too much was made of that. I don't think he meant it in a dog whistle sense at all. I think it's not a good thing that the UK has to depend on trained medical workers to keep its own health service going. It's not good for us. It's not good for the countries from which those workers are coming, because those countries need trained medical staff as well. So there is something really quite wrong about the way that the UK simply uses differentials and let's be honest, differential wages to poach people who've been trained at the expense of the countries which they come from, to come to the UK and to denude those countries of medical staff that they probably need. So it's not a healthy situation, and I think that's he's not wrong about that. So I didn't particularly take offence at that. I think a little too much was made of it.
If you were to put your long distance hat on and take us forward a whole year to November in 12 months' time, what would your prognostication, what would your forecast be of the state of the UK at that time?
Well, very hard. It's very hard to say. I mean, I think we're like I say, we're locked into, barring some event that I can't see. And of course, there have been so many events in the last 5 or 6 years that I haven't foreseen that have happened. I hesitate to sort of say something like this because it feels like a huge hostage to fortune. But barring some event that I can't foresee, I think we are in a 2-year run to the next election. And I think it's just going to be one of unfolding pain economically in terms of living standards, and of danger in the international scene as well. So I'm not optimistic that by this time next year we're all going to feel better about ourselves. I don't think energy prices will have dropped. I think the situation in Eastern Europe will still be very, very unstable. We'll either be going through the latter stages of Russia's defeat or the consequences of Russia's defeat, which are likely to be quite explosive. And I think China is biding its time and watching to see what to make of it and to look for opportunities. What it decides to do in response to what it observes is another matter. But we're at a point now where China's very conservative approach to its rise, and which has largely been a peaceful rise so far, is changing under Xi Jinping's third term. What happens there is anybody's guess. I'm not an expert on China by any means at all, but I do watch with interest and I read a lot about what's happening there, and I think there's been a change in China over the last few years and a change in its approach, and we can't really be very confident or very sure about how China is going to react in the next few years, especially to any perceptions of collective Western weakness. So it's this time next year. I just don't know. I think we will be probably 1 year further along in the process of UK decline and stagnation, mixed with episodic crisis.
Thinking about one of the things that Keir Starmer did say, I think I got this right. He said, we have to make Brexit work. How does one make Brexit work?
There is no version of Brexit that can work. Certainly not in the terms that Keir Starmer has laid out. I mean, he hasn't just talked about making Brexit work. He's talked about making this version of Brexit work, which is to say no rejoining the customs union, no rejoining the single market. The reality is that there isn't a workable version of the deal that Boris Johnson imposed in 2019. We're not suddenly going to be offered, on the basis that there's been a likeable, friendly Labour government elected in London, the kind of deal that Boris Johnson was told he couldn't have, the kind of have cake and eat it deal, where the UK suddenly gets generous trade access terms without any obligation to adhere to the rules and to the EU's version of regulatory alignment. That's just not going to happen. So if we want to repair the broken trade links with the EU, the only way that we are going to be able to do it will be on the EU's terms. And that will have to involve rejoining the single market, if not explicitly, then in name. So I don't know what Keir Starmer really means by some of the things he said, by make Brexit work, but within these very rigid red lines. He's either deceiving the electorate by setting out terms that he knows he won't be able to stick to, or he believes what he says and he will stick to them. That latter option obviously leaves Britain economically marginalised and on a path of long-term decline. The first option of saying one thing and then doing a different thing in office creates a different problem, which is that it will perpetuate the disconnect and distrust between government and electorate, which has created the platform on which authoritarian populism has been allowed to rise. So there are perils either way, and I think maybe things will change between now and the next election. I think that there are interesting comments and discussions already taking place on the right of British politics, including amongst some people who supported Brexit, recognizing that the deal that we signed up to in 2019 just isn't viable from the long-term future of the country's point of view. Maybe between now and the next election, Keir Starmer will feel emboldened to start saying similar things and to signalling a more significant step to undo the damage of Brexit. But it will be about rejoining the single market and customs union. The question of the UK's membership of the European Union is off the agenda, I think, for the foreseeable future, and I would be very surprised if within my lifetime, certainly, that happens, and I don't think the UK would survive that long anyway.
Interesting. One last question, if we may, because we're almost running out of time here, but I want to try and take it because I'm not quite sure I understand the rationale behind it. But the questioner is asking, what are David's thoughts on the BRICS countries moving to a gold standard and Saudi Arabia joining that standard? Would this mean, what would this mean for the West and the petrodollar?
Well, this has been talked about for a long time. This is a kind of, monetary Pearl Harbor that people have been talking about for 20 years. I think it hasn't happened so far because China realizes that the uncoupling of China from the US economy has as many risks for them as it does for the West. It would be mutually assured destruction. I don't think we're at the point yet where China can envisage that uncoupling. I mean, there's been some degree of deglobalization, as people call it, of sort of previously global patterns of trade and finance, beginning to sort of retrench into national or regional patterns.
Yeah.
A lot of that has happened, but even now, the Chinese economy can't function without access to Western consumer markets, and I think it's going to be a while before that's true. And certainly, without China, that project simply doesn't fly. Yeah. I think, Russia has been pushing China for a long time to go down this route, and China has done some things like diversifying its foreign currency holdings and so on, which suggests that it is at least keeping the option open. But I'd be very surprised. The China's economic position isn't great at the moment. Their projected growth rates are well below the sorts of levels that they've become accustomed to, and which for an expanding and rising country like China they really need. So the kind of step that you're talking about, would be as much of a shock for them as it would be for the West. And for that reason, I think, for now anyway, I think it's not a realistic prospect.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the whole hour, David, because it's been, we tried to be educational and informative, and you've managed to enable us to meet all these aspirations tonight.
Well, you said the time would fly by, and you were absolutely right. So it hasn't felt anything like an hour.
It goes quickly. I'm going to make a few concluding remarks now. If you could stick around for a few seconds afterwards, we go off air, I'd be very grateful.
Of course.
So there we are, folks. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have tonight. Big thanks to David, and a big thanks to all of you out there for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. And remember, if you want to find out more about the TNT Show and the other Indie Live shows and events and podcasts, go to on Independence Live. You can go to independencelive.net, and you'll get all the details there. The TNT Show is taking a break next week so that our producer, Kevin, gets a well-earned week off. We'll be back on November the 23rd at the same time, when we'll be joined by MSP Emma Roddick. So looking forward to that. And as always, please look out for my column in the Sunday National this week. There's lots of ammunition. You'll find it in the 7 Days supplement. And we bring you news of one. Gillian Keegan, who is the Education Secretary, and she said recently that nurses only usually use food banks after a breakup. Yeah, she said that. And incidentally, these comments were made while she was wearing a £10,000 Rolex. And according to the union, showed a staggering lack of empathy. I think they're being kind to her there. Thank you again to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, look after each other, and take care. Good night. See you next week.